Why avoidants come back after you pull your energy away. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop chasing, the moment you finally take a step back, they suddenly show up again? The one who was distant, elusive, or emotionally unavailable suddenly appears. What if I told you this isn't coincidence, and that understanding why it happens could completely change the way you experience love and connection? Avoidants are masters of distance. They pull away when emotions feel too intense or when they feel cornered. It's not about you being too much. It's about their need to protect themselves. And here's the paradox. When you chase, they shrink. When you withdraw, they notice. That's because avoidance is not the absence of love. It's the absence of comfort with intimacy. So when you pull your energy away, you stop feeding the patterns of push and pull. Suddenly, you're not reacting. You're not chasing. You're not giving your power away. And that's magnetic. That's the moment they start to realize what they're missing and why you're not there to fill the void anymore. This isn't manipulation. It's clarity. It's self-respect. And it's a game changer in how you experience relationships. Have you ever noticed how the moment you step back, the person who seemed distant and unreachable suddenly starts to think differently? It's almost like a switch flips inside them, and it isn't magic, it's psychology. Avoidants by nature struggle with closeness. They are wired to protect themselves from feeling too vulnerable, from exposing the raw, messy parts of themselves that they believe could be rejected or judged. And while it can feel frustrating, confusing, even cruel when they pull away, it's not about you being too much or not enough. It's about their internal pattern, their automatic response to intimacy. When you are present, available, and chasing, it triggers their defense mechanism. They start to feel trapped, anxious, or overwhelmed, even if they genuinely care about you. The closer you try to get, the further they retreat, and it's easy to interpret that as disinterest or lack of love. But when you pull your energy back, when you give yourself space and stop feeding the chase, something remarkable begins to happen. You create a mirror in which they can finally see themselves and their behavior without the pressure of you chasing them down. Distance, in this context, is not coldness or punishment. It's a tool that allows reflection to happen naturally. Avoidants rarely reflect on their feelings when they're being pursued because chasing keeps them in survival mode. They're too busy managing the external pressure to look inward. When you step back, you remove the external noise, and suddenly they are left alone with their thoughts, and without the distraction of your constant attention, they start to notice patterns they had been avoiding. They start to question why they pulled away, why they felt restless when everything was fine, why they were unable to fully show up even when they cared. This reflection is often uncomfortable because it forces them to confront emotions they're not used to handling. But discomfort is the birthplace of growth. When you're not there to chase or appease them, they can no longer ignore the tension between what they want emotionally and how they act behaviorally. When you pull your energy away, you also give them the chance to feel the consequences of their distance. Absence can highlight value in a way presence cannot. It's one thing to have someone always available, always willing to engage, always leaning in, but that can create complacency or even emotional blindness. Avoidance in particular can become desensitized to love when it's always on their terms. But when you take a step back, suddenly your presence is no longer guaranteed, and they are forced to reflect on what your absence means. Why does it matter that you're not around as much? What feelings come up when you don't respond immediately or when you refocusing on your own life instead of being available to them? These questions naturally stir internal reflection because they expose the gap between their desire for connection and their habitual avoidance. This reflection doesn't happen overnight, and it's not a linear process. Avoidants are complex. They often oscillate between wanting intimacy and fearing it. The act of pulling away creates a pause, a moment of stillness that allows them to process their emotions in a way they rarely do when they feel pursued. When you are always in the mix, they are constantly reacting to your energy, to your needs, and to the push-pull dynamic, which keeps them in a state of emotional reactivity rather than introspection. But when you withdraw, you remove the reactive element, and that space allows them to consider their feelings more deeply. They start to realize what they might have been missing, how their withdrawal affected the connection, and sometimes even how much they value the stability and presence you bring when it is offered on your terms It's important to understand that this reflection is not about guilt or shame. It's about awareness. Avoidants often operate unconsciously, running patterns that keep them at a safe emotional distance. Stepping back doesn't force them to change immediately, but it creates the conditions for them to notice their own behavior and its impact. In other words, distance sparks insight. It's the moment where they start asking themselves questions they never allowed themselves to ask before. It's where they start to confront the gap between their emotional desires and their actions. And the more consistently you maintain your own boundaries and energy, the more profound this reflection becomes. They begin to see that your presence is a choice, that your attention is not endless, and that real connection requires them to show up, not just emotionally, but consciously. Ultimately, the act of stepping back is not about manipulation. It's about creating space for them to do the internal work they usually avoid. Avoidants are often unaware of the emotional patterns they're trapped in until something interrupts their autopilot. Your distance acts as that interruption. It's the mirror in which they can finally see themselves. And while it may feel painful to not be in control of their realization or timing, the truth is that meaningful change, real, lasting growth, can only happen when they confront their own internal reality. Pulling your energy away is not a test or a punishment. It's a powerful invitation for reflection, awareness, and ultimately a chance for them to show up differently if they are willing to engage with the process. One of the most misunderstood dynamics with avoidant personalities is the subtle, almost invisible way in which your own energy affects them. They are incredibly sensitive to emotional energy, even if they are unwilling to admit it, even if they try to act like nothing matters. And when I say energy, I'm not talking about grand gestures or dramatic declarations of love. I'm talking about the way you carry yourself emotionally, the way you respond, and the level of availability and intensity you bring into the interaction. Avoidants are wired to scan the room for emotional demand. They unconsciously measure how much pressure, how much attachment, how much need is being projected onto them at any given moment. When they perceive too much, they instinctively retreat. But the opposite is just as powerful. When your energy shifts, they notice it, sometimes before you even say a word. Think of it this way. Human beings are energy mirrors, and avoidants are particularly reactive mirrors. They will unconsciously reflect the emotional state around them. When you are chasing, when your energy is constantly leaning toward them, they instinctively pull away because the dynamic triggers their fear of being overwhelmed. They are almost wired to resist being caught in someone else's emotional tide. But the moment you pull back, the moment you reclaim your energy, the moment you stop giving them the constant signals of need or expectation, you create a ripple effect. Suddenly, they begin to mirror a different energy, a curiosity, a longing, a subtle recognition of your value. It's not that they are manipulative in a conscious way. It's that human beings, particularly avoidants, respond to energy at a subconscious level before they ever put thought into it. This is why stepping back can feel almost like magic. One day, you are fully invested, fully available, and almost invisible to them in terms of emotional impact because they are focused on their own boundaries and defenses. The next day, you start to prioritize yourself, you start to reclaim your time, you start to radiate a sense of calm confidence, and suddenly they notice. That shift is magnetic, not because you did anything dramatic, but because your energy now signals that you are whole, that you are centered, that your happiness is not dependent on their approval or attention. Avoidants are drawn to that kind of stability without even fully realizing why. It's important to understand that this isn't about playing games or creating scarcity artificially. It's about genuinely aligning your energy with your own priorities and your own self-respect. When your energy is scattered, desperate, or overly focused on them, it triggers their withdrawal. But when your energy is self-contained, strong, and steady, it challenges their pattern. It invites them to notice you in a new way, not as a source of pressure, but as a fully formed person with boundaries, with autonomy, and with value that exists independently of their reactions. The mirror effect here is profound. They see your energy and unconsciously compare it to their own. They start to recognize that perhaps the dynamic has been off balance. that they have been taking more than they've been giving, and that maybe they want to engage differently if they're willing to step into it. Your energy communicates far more than words ever could. Avoidants are particularly attuned to non-verbal cues, the small vibrations in tone, posture, responsiveness, and attention. When you maintain your energy, they feel it in the subtle spaces of the relationship, the pauses in conversation, the calm in your presence, the absence of urgency in your pursuit. That absence is not emptiness, it's meaning. It signals that you are not dependent, that you have a life that is fulfilling and engaging without them being at the center of it. And when they feel that, they are forced to reflect, even if only subconsciously, on what it is they might be missing. Your energy becomes a mirror reflecting not just your value, but also the reality of their own behavior, their own distance, and the potential for connection if they're willing to show up. What's fascinating is how sensitive this effect can be. Avoidants often don't respond immediately. Sometimes they test the waters. Sometimes they withdraw even further at first. That's part of the pattern. They are negotiating internally with the new energy you are presenting. But the more consistently you maintain your own energy, the clearer the reflection becomes. They start to recognize, often with surprise, that you are not going to chase, that you are not going to compromise your standards, that your attention is not something they can take for granted. And that recognition sparks curiosity. They begin to wonder why the dynamic has changed, why the interaction feels different, why your presence or absence is having an impact they didn't expect. This mirror effect also creates a subtle shift in the power dynamic, and that can be incredibly transformative. Avoidants often thrive in relationships where they feel in control, where the other person's energy is directed toward them. When you reclaim your energy, you disrupt that familiar pattern. You are no longer a passive participant. You are an active agent of your own emotional reality. That change is almost irresistible because avoidants are attracted to authenticity and strength. Even if they fear it at first, they sense that you are no longer available as a constant emotional crutch. And that forces them to consider how they want to engage if they want to maintain any connection. The key takeaway is that your energy is not just about what you give, it's about what you embody. Confidence, self-respect, calmness, emotional stability. These are not qualities you project artificially. They are qualities that emerge naturally when you step back, focus on yourself, and refuse to chase. Avoidants sense it immediately. Your energy becomes a mirror that shows them what they cannot create for themselves, what they have been avoiding in terms of vulnerability, emotional honesty, and presence. It's in that moment of reflection that you start to see shifts, that patterns begin to change, and that avoidants begin to engage in a way they couldn't when you were constantly leaning in. One of the most paradoxical realities in relationships with avoidants is the way they respond to pursuit versus withdrawal. It seems counterintuitive at first because most of us have been conditioned to believe that showing more interest, giving more attention, and chasing someone will create closeness. We assume that the more we try to connect, the more they will engage. But with avoidance, it's often the exact opposite. Chasing triggers their escape reflex. It's as if the more you lean in, the more they feel cornered, the more their instinct is to pull away, sometimes dramatically, sometimes subtly, but always consistently. They don't necessarily pull away because they don't care. They pull away because the intensity of your pursuit highlights their own discomfort with intimacy. Avoidants are not indifferent to emotion. They are hyper aware of it. They feel things deeply, but they have an internal mechanism that pushes them to protect themselves from being overwhelmed. When you chase, they perceive a level of emotional demand that unconsciously signals danger. They may fear losing control, fear being engulfed, or fear being vulnerable in ways they're not ready for. This is why no matter how perfect you are, no matter how patient you try to be, pushing too hard often backfires. It triggers the exact opposite of the response you desire. The more you run toward them emotionally, the more they instinctively retreat. This is where the power of withdrawal becomes so profound. Withdrawal is not about manipulation or punishment. It's about creating space for awareness. When you pull back, you remove the external pressure that keeps them running on autopilot. Suddenly, they are left in a state where they must confront their own feelings instead of reacting to yours. And that confrontation is transformative. It's the moment where they can begin to see the gap between what they truly want and how they have been behaving. When your energy is no longer consumed by chasing, it creates a kind of emotional vacuum that they cannot ignore. They start to notice the absence of your attention, the absence of your immediate availability, and it forces reflection. The withdrawal forces awareness in a way that chasing never can. When you are pursuing, the dynamic is always reactive. You are reacting to their distance, they are reacting to your intensity, and the entire relationship becomes a loop of avoidance and pursuit. There is little room for true introspection because both parties are caught up in the cycle of action and reaction. But when you step back, when you stop chasing, you break the loop. The space you create is not empty, it is charged with the potential for insight. Avoidants are suddenly faced with the reality that your attention is finite, that your presence is not guaranteed, and that they cannot take your care for granted. That awareness, even if initially uncomfortable, opens the door for them to question their own behavior and the impact it has on the connection. One of the most fascinating things about this dynamic is how quickly it can shift their perception. Chasing often creates a sense of urgency or even obligation, which avoidants resist. Withdrawal, on the other hand, removes urgency but increases clarity. By stepping back, you allow them to engage with their feelings without the pressure of your pursuit distorting their awareness. They can think, reflect, and feel in a way they couldn't before. They begin to recognize patterns they were previously blind to, the way they pull away when things get too close, the way they fear being engulfed, the way they unconsciously test boundaries. Withdrawal shines a light on their behavior, not through confrontation or accusation, but through absence and presence in the right measure. It's important to note that withdrawal is not a temporary tool to elicit a reaction. It's an embodiment of self-respect and emotional maturity. Avoidants are particularly sensitive to authenticity. If they sense that your withdrawal is manipulative or insincere, it will not have the desired effect. But if your energy, your attention, and your engagement shift naturally because you are aligning with your own needs and boundaries, the change becomes magnetic. They start to notice not just your absence, but the groundedness, stability, and autonomy that your presence, or lack thereof, communicates. This awareness often triggers curiosity and reflection. Why are you not chasing? Why do you seem unaffected? What is it that makes you different from the usual dynamic they have with others? This shift from chase to withdrawal also changes the emotional landscape of the relationship. Avoidants are often caught in a loop of self-protection, where they unconsciously push people away as a way of maintaining control over closeness. But when you withdraw in a confident, self-respecting way, you interrupt that loop. The emotional chase that once drove them away is replaced by a quiet, steady presence that is no longer available on demand. This absence creates a new kind of emotional tension, not one of fear or pressure, but of curiosity and recognition. They start to see that connection does not have to mean loss of autonomy, that intimacy can exist without suffocating them, and that your boundaries are not a threat but a reflection of your value. Ultimately, the paradox is this: the more you chase, the more avoidants escape, the more you withdraw, the more they become aware of themselves, their feelings, and their potential for connection. This is why pulling your energy away is not only powerful, it's transformative. It breaks the cycle, creates clarity, and allows the avoidant to engage on a level that was impossible when they were reacting to pursuit. Withdrawal creates awareness. Awareness creates reflection, and reflection creates the possibility for a deeper, more conscious connection. When you understand this dynamic, you stop interpreting avoidance as rejection and start seeing it as a pattern that can be shifted, not through chasing, but through the strategic, authentic reclamation of your own energy and presence. One of the biggest mistakes people make with avoidance is confusing intensity with influence. We think that the more we obsess, the more we focus, the more we try to prove our worth, the more they will finally see us, value us, and engage. But with avoidance, obsession has the opposite effect. It triggers their defenses, it reinforces their patterns of withdrawal, and it keeps the relationship locked in a cycle of push and pull. Obsession signals dependency, and dependency is something avoidants are wired to resist. They are not indifferent to love or care, but they are sensitive to pressure, to neediness, and to emotional demand. When someone leans too heavily into them, the natural response is to step back. It's not personal, it's protective. Empowerment, on the other hand, communicates something completely different. Empowerment is not about chasing, overanalyzing, or trying to manipulate them into engagement. Empowerment is about reclaiming your own life, your own energy, and your own sense of worth, regardless of their behavior. It is about cultivating a presence that is self-contained and magnetic. When you operate from empowerment rather than obsession, you immediately shift the dynamic. Avoidants, who are used to sensing dependency and reacting to it, notice the difference. Instead of triggering fear or resistance, your energy now communicates strength, stability, and autonomy. This shift is subtle but powerful. It changes the way they perceive you, the way they interact, and the way they reflect on their own behavior. Empowerment is about clarity of boundaries. It's about knowing what you will tolerate, what you won't tolerate, and being consistent with those boundaries. Avoidants respond more favorably to people who are steady and grounded than to people who are constantly chasing, questioning, or trying to pull them closer. Boundaries are not barriers. They are signposts of self-respect. When you maintain your boundaries, you demonstrate that your attention, time, and energy are valuable, and that you will not compromise your standards for anyone. This is deeply attractive, not because it is manipulative, but because it signals confidence, maturity, and self-worth, qualities that avoidants unconsciously admire and respond to. Empowerment also involves focusing on your own life, your own growth, and your own passions. When you are obsessed, your world revolves around them. Every thought, every action, every decision is filtered through the lens of how they might react or respond. This is draining, ineffective, and ultimately unattractive. But when you shift the focus back to yourself, you create a natural magnetism. Your life becomes vibrant, dynamic, and independent, and avoidants are drawn to that energy. They notice that you are not dependent on them for your happiness, that you are fully capable of thriving without their constant presence, and that you bring value into the relationship because it is a choice, not a compulsion. This distinction is critical. It turns engagement from a reaction to a conscious decision, and that is profoundly different from the dynamic created by obsession. Empowerment over obsession also means letting go of the illusion of control. With obsession, we think that if we just try harder, if we just pursue more strategically, if we just read every signal perfectly, we can somehow force an avoidant to engage. But avoidants resist control. They need to feel autonomy. When you operate from empowerment, you stop trying to control their behavior, and you instead focus on controlling your own energy and reactions. This is liberating. It frees you from the constant anxiety of chasing, from the endless cycles of interpretation, and from the emotional turbulence that comes with obsession. And ironically, it is this very freedom that makes you more compelling to an avoidant, because they unconsciously recognize that you are not a threat to their independence. You are a partner who respects both your autonomy and theirs. Empowerment also shifts the emotional tone of the relationship. Obsession creates tension, anxiety, and a sense of urgency that the avoidant instinctively resists. Empowerment creates calm, presence, and steadiness that they unconsciously mirror. When your energy is grounded, consistent, and self-assured, avoidants are more likely to engage because they no longer feel pressured. They can approach the connection on their own terms, which paradoxically makes them more likely to lean in rather than pull away. Empowerment changes the rules of the interaction. You are no longer chasing a reaction. You are offering presence, availability, and connection without compromise, which is infinitely more magnetic than the neediness and anxiety produced by obsession. Finally, empowerment is about self-validation. You no longer measure your worth by their attention, their affection, or their engagement. Your confidence, your self-esteem, and your sense of value come from within, and that internal strength communicates itself in every interaction. Avoidants are drawn to self-contained people because it mirrors qualities they often struggle to embody themselves. They see someone who is strong, independent, and clear about their worth, and it challenges them to reflect on their own behavior and patterns. They begin to notice the contrast between a person who obsesses and someone who empowers themselves, and that awareness can spark the exact kind of engagement you have been hoping for, but this time on equal footing, without compromise, and with mutual respect. Empowerment over obsession is the ultimate way to influence without chasing, to draw without pressure, and to create space for an avoidant to engage consciously. It is not manipulation. It is not games. It is presence, clarity, and self-respect. When you operate from empowerment, you stop reacting to their patterns and start creating your own rhythm, your own energy, and your own narrative, which is infinitely more magnetic than obsession could ever be. One of the most empowering realizations when dealing with avoidance is understanding that patterns are not fixed. Avoidant behavior may feel permanent because it's deeply ingrained, but the truth is it's a pattern of coping, not a reflection of their capacity for connection or love. Avoidants often retreat because intimacy triggers discomfort, not because they don't care or can't feel deeply. Recognizing that these patterns exist is the first step. Understanding that they can shift when approached consciously is transformative. When you create space, maintain boundaries, and focus on your own energy, you aren't trying to change them by force. You are creating conditions in which change becomes possible. Patterns shift when the push and pull dynamic is disrupted. Avoidants are used to a certain rhythm. They pull, you chase, they distance, you pursue. It's a loop that reinforces their automatic responses and keeps them operating unconsciously. Every time you chase, you reinforce the pattern. Their withdrawal is successful and your pursuit signals that the cycle works. But when you stop chasing, when you pull back, when you reclaim your energy, the loop is broken. This disruption creates an opportunity for reflection and adjustment. They are no longer reacting on autopilot. They have to recalibrate because the usual rules no longer apply. And it's in this recalibration that patterns can begin to shift. Boundaries are a crucial element in changing patterns. Avoidants respond to structure and clarity more than to emotional intensity. By consistently defining what is acceptable behavior and what is not, you show them that connection does not have to mean chaos, desperation, or suffocation. Boundaries are not walls, they are guides. They demonstrate self-respect and establish a framework in which intimacy can be explored safely. When you hold your boundaries, avoidants begin to see that closeness does not have to trigger panic or retreat. It can exist alongside autonomy and mutual respect. Over time, this realization can slowly rewire their behavior and responses. Consistency is equally important. Avoidants are often hyper-aware of inconsistency because it creates uncertainty and discomfort. If your behavior is predictable, your boundaries are firm, and your energy is steady, it teaches them a new rhythm for relating. They start to learn that engagement does not mean losing control, that connection can be steady and reliable, and that they can show up emotionally without fear of being engulfed. Change doesn't happen overnight, but repeated exposure to this new dynamic gradually shifts the default pattern. The more consistently you maintain your energy, boundaries, and autonomy, the more they begin to internalize that connection can exist in a way that feels safe and sustainable. Patterns can also shift when your presence is selective rather than reactive. Avoidants are naturally drawn to people who are not entirely available, not because you are playing a game, but because they are intrigued by your self-containment. When you are not constantly responding, chasing, or bending yourself to accommodate them, you send a subtle but powerful message. Your engagement is a choice and your energy is finite. This changes the pattern because it forces them to reconsider their behavior in the context of consequences. They begin to recognize that withdrawal no longer guarantees your attention or that chasing no longer guarantees a response. This awareness nudges them toward more conscious, intentional behavior, which can slowly reshape old avoidance patterns. It's important to remember that shifting patterns is a gradual process. Avoidants are often resistant at first. They may test boundaries, pull back more intensely, or even act out in ways designed to restore the old dynamic. This is normal. Change is uncomfortable, and breaking old habits requires time and consistency. Your role is not to control or manipulate, but to remain consistent, empowered, and grounded in your own energy. The more you model this new way of being, calm, self-contained, and respectful of both your needs and theirs, the more the avoidant is given a template for how to engage differently. Patterns can also shift when you detach from the outcome. Obsession with results, fixation on their engagement, or desperate attempts to control their behavior only reinforce the old cycle. When you focus on your own life, your own growth, and your own emotional autonomy, you are operating from a position of strength. This detachment is not indifference. It is clarity. It communicates that you are whole and complete on your own, which paradoxically encourages them to step in and engage in a healthier, more conscious way. They see a version of connection that is balanced, sustainable, and aligned with mutual respect, which slowly reshapes their avoidance responses. Finally, patterns shift when reflection and awareness are allowed to occur. Avoidants rarely confront their own behavior under pressure, but they do reflect when the dynamic changes. By reclaiming your energy, enforcing boundaries, and focusing on empowerment rather than obsession, you create a space for them to notice their own patterns, their automatic reactions, and the consequences of their distance. This reflection is the seed of change. It may not lead to immediate transformation, but it opens the door for avoidants to engage more consciously, to recognize their triggers, and to slowly, incrementally shift the way they show up in relationships. As we wrap up today, I want you to remember this. Relationships with avoidance are not about chasing or forcing someone to feel what you feel. They are about understanding patterns, reclaiming your energy, and showing up as your most confident, grounded, and empowered self. Pulling back is not rejection, it's clarity, it's self-respect, it's the magnetism that naturally draws them in and encourages reflection, growth, and conscious engagement. Every step you take toward honoring your own energy, setting healthy boundaries, and focusing on your life is a step toward transforming not only the dynamic with them, but also your own experience of love, connection, and self-worth. You don't need to fix anyone, manipulate anyone, or chase endlessly to create a meaningful bond. You simply need to embody the best version of yourself, the one who is whole, steady, and unapologetically authentic. Thank you all so much for taking this time to explore these ideas with me today. I truly hope you leave with clarity, confidence, and a renewed sense of your own value. Remember, the power to transform patterns, attract conscious engagement, and cultivate meaningful connection always starts with you. Carry that awareness with you, honor your boundaries, and trust in your worth. I deeply appreciate your attention, your openness, and your willingness to reflect on this. Stay empowered, stay authentic, and never forget that the most magnetic energy you can offer in any relationship is your own. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I wish you all the very best on your journey towards stronger, healthier, and more conscious connections.